So next up, we're going to take a little look at the different factors that influence aggressive behaviour. So first of all, there's a number of situational factors that seem to influence aggressive behaviour. Much more likely to happen when players are losing than when they're winning, than when they think they've been on the wrong end of an unfair decision by the ref, when they're embarrassed, and are playing below their capabilities. They've performed something really badly, or they're just generally having a bit of a nightmare. And when they're physically in pain, people are more likely to lash out and be aggressive. And there are a number of different contextual factors that are important. For instance, environmental temperature. More violent crime, for example, happens in hot weather, and we're going to look at a paper on Friday that shows that physical temperature actually influences the number of fouls that happen in sport as well. Level of competition, so more aggressive behaviour tending to happen at a lower level. The more contact there is in a sport, the more aggression you get. The more important the contest is, the higher the aggression level goes. The influence of the coach, so does the coach encourage or discourage aggressive behaviour? Team norms, so do the team have an expectation that you're going to be aggressive in your play? Aggression more likely to happen when we're playing away from home than at home, more likely to happen when we're low in the league than high in the league, and more likely to happen towards the end of a game rather than the beginning of a game. So all those things can have an influence. But we also know that biology plays a role. For example, sex. We know that males score much higher on physical aggression than females, and higher on most other kinds of aggression, like verbal aggression, but the difference isn't as stark. Males are much more likely to commit violent crime, for example, than females. Why? Well, we know there's a link between testosterone levels and aggression, such that high levels seem to be linked to more aggression, but also females, certainly in the past and even today to some extent, are socialised into repressing aggressive feelings more than males. Personality is important. We know that extroverts tend to like arousing situations, as we've looked at with personality. They're more argumentative as well than introverts, and extroverts, because of this, are more likely to behave aggressively. Interestingly, there's a difference between between those with low and high IQs in aggression levels. Now, there's a lot of controversy over the measure of IQ in psychology and how well, for example, it measures general intelligence. However, there's a number of interesting things that correlate well with IQ, one of which is aggressive behaviour, which has been shown in some very large studies, including some interesting twin studies and studies comparing adopted and non-adopted children. And in all of that work, there seems to be some interesting links, both between IQ and aggressive behaviour. The higher your IQ, the less likely you are to engage in aggressive behaviour, presumably because the lower your IQ, the less likely you are to be able to reason through the possible consequences for you of aggressive behaviour. With genetics, we know that twin studies have shown that there's a strong genetic influence on aggressive behaviour, such that, for example, identical twins are much more similar in their aggression levels than non-identical twins. And there's also been some interesting studies that I mentioned, for example, comparing adopted and non-adopted children. And we're beginning even to find out about some of the specific genes and combinations of genes that might influence aggressive behaviour. In general, we know that frontal lobe dysfunction seems to be associated with violent behaviour. So people with dysfunction in that brain area are much more likely to behave aggressively. And there are also differences in the actual brain structure in certain areas between, for example, people are likely to be highly aggressive, such as psychopaths, although psychopaths aren't always aggressive necessarily. And so there's some really interesting research on the genetics. Interesting to look at Waltz and colleagues' recent study. Their review, it's a bit heavy going, but well worth a little look. Moral reasoning is also important, and that essentially is our ability to make independent moral judgments. Kohlberg came up with a model of moral development, and basically what we find is aggressive behaviour is much more likely at the low end of the scale than at the high end. So at the lowest end we have a kind of moral reasoning of, well, don't do it or else. There's no reason as to why you shouldn't do it other than you get punished if you do. Then children start maturing and they think, well, if I behave in certain ways, can I gain an advantage? So if I behave really nicely and do the housework for mum, I'll get more pocket money, for example. So the behaviour starts to resolve around getting advantages. Then they start learning that there's certain behaviours that go with being, for example, a good person in society. So good boys and girls don't do this, bad boys and girls do that. Then we have a law and order kind of stage, which is where we say, well, we should obey rules. It's really important that we obey the rules that society set us. The next highest level then is where we decide that what's right depends on our personal values. So we start to develop a more independent set of moral reasons, and eventually a universal set of ethical principles that can guide our actions in lots of different situations, which is the highest level of moral reasoning. The interesting point here is that people don't perceive aggression as immoral at the lower levels, and that might also explain why there's a relationship between sport participation and aggression. Sport isn't always positive, and maybe it's a bit more nuanced than social learning theory would have us believe. Maybe the level of moral reasoning of participants is a key factor.